Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Chabura Shiur. Today we have with us the privilege and pleasure to have Rabbi Yosef Zarnighian. We're going to be exploring insights into Jewish identity from the Teshuvot of Ḥakham Ben-Tsion. A little bit about our speaker. Rabbi Yosef Zarnighian is the assistant rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese Kahal Kadosh Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. He was born and raised in Great Neck, New York. Prior to graduating from Queens College with a degree in economics, he pursued the rabbinic path of his great-grandfather by studying under Rabbi Chaim Sabato and Rabbi Nachum I. Rabinovich, Rabbi Zarnighian subsequently received semicha from Rabbi Sam Kassin and Rabbi Yaakov Peretz of the Shehebar Sephardic Center in Jerusalem. He serves his country as a chaplain in the U.S. Air Force Reserve and also works as a translator of medieval Sephardic Jewish texts from the Shehakol Project. Thank God we had Rabbi Zarnighian with us many times in the past, and I highly recommend to check out those shiurim. We are praying for the safety and for the quick, peaceful solution to all of this situation. May our learning today be a zechut for all of our soldiers and for all of the people who need health and for all of our hostages. And with that said, the floor is yours, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Amen. Ken Yiratzon should be a zechut for all of our brethren in Medinat Israel. And with everyone's permission, I'm going to begin screen sharing. So we begin with the Teshuvot Or LeSion. Or LeSion, which is our focus for today, was authored by Gaon Ben-Tsion Abba Shaul Shalom. Ben-Tsion Abba Shaul, dear to my heart, because for those who know me, I'm Persian, he was Persian. So among the Persian Ḥakhamim, he definitely stands out as perhaps one of the most towering. Until today, he also serves as the basis of 20th/21st century Teshuvot, the source of halakha for many Persian communities around the world. The Teshuvah that we're going to study today pertains to the status of Gerim, converts to Judaism, who later disavow or de facto present themselves as disavowing Jewish practice and Jewish life. What exactly does it mean to disavow, and at what point do we draw that line, is going to be the bulk of the Teshuvah. But one of the things I want to point out as a disclaimer before we begin is, this stance of Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, generally speaking, and I say generally speaking because I only have anecdotal evidence, in my experience is not the normative position that's adopted among most Batei Din, most rabbinical courts that administer giur and that tend to matters of conversion. It is adopted by some, and for that reason, it's important to study it because of the fact that this is the standard procedure among some Batei Din, and B, because it's a well thought out and thorough teshuvah and decision of a great Ḥakham that is worthy of study, in my opinion. A little bit about the life of Ḥakham Ben-Tsion. He was born to two Persian parents who immigrated from Iran to Yerushalayim. He grew up in Eretz Israel. Born in, I believe, 1924, passed away in 1998. Unfortunately, towards the end of his life, he was in a very fragile state of health. He's perhaps known as the Oker Harim counterpart to the Sinai side of Ḥakham Ovadia. What Ḥakham Ovadia Yosef of blessed memory had in his encyclopedic knowledge, Ḥakham Ben-Tsion was famous for complimenting him in his very sharp and profound skill of iyun, of analysis. We're going to see the common theme in Ḥakham Ben-Tsion's Teshuvot, unlike that of Ḥakham Ovadia, whether that's in his Yabiya Omer or the Haredat, you're not going to see too many sources quoted. You're not going to see the buffet of Bechen Katav, and so writes this Ḥakham and that Ḥakham. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion is pretty traditional in that he sticks to the primary sources. The sources in the Talmud, the sources in the Tosefta, the Yerushalmi, the Rishonim, and some Acharonim. He, in addition to Or Sion, he also authored other works, some of which are insights into his chidushim on different masechtot in the Talmud. And he also wrote a wonderful work of Musar that is widely studied among many circles. Having said that, we're going to begin on the left-hand side over here. And Ḥakham Ben-Tsion begins as follows. This is, by the way, for a point of reference, volume 1 of Or Sion, Siman Yod Bet. Ger she'nitgayer ve'en noek minhag Yisrael. Here he's giving you the case where it's a generic case. It's not a ma'aseh she'haya. It's a broad case that Ḥakham Ben-Tsion is ruling on as a general rule regarding a person who converts to Judaism but does not act in accordance with minhag Yisrael. Hashiv ger or lo. Is he, from the point of view of law, considered a convert or not? What's the question over here? So Ḥakham Ben-Tsion begins by saying that I saw it fit to investigate this topic. Bidin hagarim beyamen. Nowadays, again, you have to remember when he's writing this. He's writing this presumably in the mid-1900s, perhaps in the 60s or 70s. Sherabi mehem enam mitnahagim kedinei haTorah v'mitzvot. You have a lot of converts, many of whom are not observant. In other words, there's a very important point over here to be observant of, to pick up on. The question that's being raised is not so much on the procedural standards of the Bet Din. The Bet Din in question, 100% kasher. The question is on the conduct of the converts. Id dinam kegere sedek or lo. Do they have the status of righteous converts or not? Why do we care about this question? Can he marry a Jew or Jewess? And likewise, this question also applies for women. Can such women marry Jewish men? Can they be relied on for various things? Do they have the status of nidah, etc., etc.? Now, Ḥakham Ben-Tsion begins by adopting the position that most people already assume. At first glance, he says it's possible to say, since the Bet Din was done through a bona fide and recognized Bet Din procedurally, there were no shortcuts, everything was handled in accordance with the law. They informed the convert of the principles of Jewish law and belief. The Talmud in Masechet Yevamot, as we're going to elaborate on shortly, gives the minimum criteria being that of miksat mitzvot kalot, miksat mitzvot chamurot. You have to inform the ger of some, what we call severe mitzvot, and some minor mitzvot. Shabbat, avodah zarah, these are big things. Minor mitzvot as well. Men, you have to wear tefillin, you have to wear tzitzit. Women, you have your own laws that pertain to you as well. Laws that pertain to both men and women, and etc., etc. Once the sample of the mitzvot, the digest of the mitzvot, are presented to the prospective converts, the Bet Din, based on their judgment, is able to go forward with the conversion, with the gibur. So at first glance, it seems like the Bet Din followed these standards, and there shouldn't be a question. Kedamrina migmara, the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot, like I just mentioned, presents this being the criteria needed for a valid conversion. Bechen pasak Rambam. Maimonides also rules like this in chapter 14 of the laws of Isur Biyah. Maran in the Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah, Siman Resh Samechet. That's the famous siman that deals with conversions, as well as the following siman thereafter. He says, even though this convert may, in the recesses of his or her heart, believe to not want to take everything on, at the end of the day, they informed the Bet Din that they do wish to take everything on. What they believe they're going to actually fulfill as far as practice of the mitzvot in the recesses of their hearts should seem irrelevant. Ḥakham alam, because we adopt the canon, it's a rule in halacha, the Gemara in Kiddushin states a very famous rule, Dvarim shebalev enam devarim. Matters of the heart are null and void. Meaning, for legal purposes, when a person is delivering a statement, an affidavit, a testimony in front of a bet din, in this case, the acceptance of the mitzvot for the convert, we care about what that individual is saying. Right? That's why we have a concept of perjury in halacha. You can perjure yourself, which is a serious crime. So, and anybody can get away with perjury if they just say, "Oh, I didn't mean it." Right? So we don't care about your words. We don't care about your intents. We care about your words. And therefore, if such a convert is no longer observant, we don't say he's not a Jew or she's not a Jew. We just say he's a Yisrael Muman. He's like any other Jew in the world who's gone off the path, and they need to do teshuvah. But they could still get married. They still have to observe the laws of nidah. If they're a married couple, they still have to keep Shabbat, etc., etc. Among the Shelot Chuvot Achiezer, this is also the position that's adopted, and this is, for all intents and purposes, according to Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, one approach. It says, "Ulam yireh shedinam kesafek gerim." This is going to be the thesis of Ḥakham Ben-Tsion's position. In his view, such a convert has the status of a safek ger, i.e., a safek Yehudi. What on earth does that mean? How could you be a doubtful Jew? So he's going to explain. As God willing, I'm going to explain. We have to introduce the first defense for this position from the Gemara Bechorot. The Gemara Bechorot, I'll explain that Gemara outside, talks about an incident of Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Hanina was a Kohen. And as we know, Kohanim, among their regular duties, also have the occasional privilege to administer Pidyon Haben. You have a firstborn male to a couple, they come before the Kohen, they redeem him for the Hamisha Silaim, what is roughly estimated to be 100 grams worth of silver, and we throw a lavish ceremony for the redemption. There was an incident with a particular parent who was a cheapskate, and he didn't want to actually give over the Hamisha Silaim to Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Hanina was the administering Kohen. They honored him with the Pidyon Haben, and he was going back and forth. The Gemara says he was walking back and forth in front of him, with the indication that he was antsy. He wanted his money back. And Rabbi Hanina says, "I'm sorry, because of what you just did, I was going to give your money back to you. The Kohen has a right to do that. But because of your petty eagerness to want to anticipating that I would pay you back," he says, "this pidyon is not valid." Why isn't it valid? That's going to be a question that we'll deal with in 1 second, which Ḥakham Ben-Tsion ties into the case of the conversion. But he goes on and says that Maimonides, Rambam, in the laws of Bikurim, says as follows. He says, "Shedafka in ichziram lo hakohen ein haben padul." If the Kohen saw the guy wants his money back, and because of that he actually gave the money back to him, then the pidyon is not valid, because the transaction was never made in good faith. And he says, direct quote, "Velo yiten lo hu," the father should not give to the Kohen v'da'ato sheyatzir, with the intent that the father should return, that the Kohen should return the silver. V'im asa ken v'hechzir lo, if he in fact did this, that criterion A, criterion B, v'hechzir lo, and he did return it, apologize. The pidyon is not, the redemption of the firstborn is not valid until he intends to give the currency or the money to the Kohen as a full-fledged gift. Okay. This presents itself to be problematic. Why is this a problem? Ben-Tsion says, "V'kasher." Problem is, what difference does it make if the father had in mind that the Kohen is going to give the money back or not? At the end of the day, the Gemara is not talking about a case where dad goes to the Kohen and says, Mr. Kohen, Rabbi Hanina in this case, I would like to redeem my firstborn son from you, but I want you to know I don't really want to do this. I'm giving you the 100 grams of silver, and you better give it back to me or else. He pulls a mafia slogan on him and expects the money to be returned. Fine. If that's the case, there's no debate. Everybody agrees there is no matana gemura. And so it's not the transaction is not valid, just like any transaction is invalid if you intend to be repaid immediately. So I understand that. But here, the guy is not saying anything. He's just antsy. He's walking back and forth. As far as we know, as far as what is revealed to us, the guy is giving the Kohen he's giving him the Chamisha Silaim, he's giving him the silver, and it's a done deal. So why shouldn't we apply the previous rule in Halakha, Dvarim Shebalev Enam Dvarim? We don't care about what's in the guy's heart. So that question is raised. And Ben-Tsion says that Tosafot over there raises this very question. And Tosafot raises two possible resolutions to this. Resolution A, Tosafot says, even though the guy gave it to the Kohen without specifying his intentions, Tosafot says you could claim that there is an exception to the rule where it is obvious to us, where it is obvious through behavior, through body language, if you will, that the individual didn't mean to transact with the Kohen sincerely, then this overrides, or rather the clause, the canon of Devarim Shebalev Enam Devarim, person's inner intentions don't matter, does not apply here. Because Devarim Shebalev Enam Devarim, according to resolution A of Tosafot, only applies where we don't have evidence presenting to the contrary. That is the modus operandi of how we perceive a person's statements, a person's testimony, when it is generic, where I don't have any reason to suspect that there are ulterior motives or different intentions. But if I suspect something else, then that overrides this. And he says, this is a case that Abba talks about of a person who makes a transaction and he sells an item. Let's say he sells his home or he sells his property, and he does so not because he really wants to sell and say move to another house, but because the guy needs the money, he needs to pay off a loan or something along those lines. He's desperate for cash, and later the money is, it comes to him through some other means. Borei Olam helps him out, and he finds a benefactor to pay off his debt, and now he doesn't need to sell his property. So perhaps it's similar to the case over there, where we say that the person's, according to one view in the Talmud, the person's transaction is negated. It's a nullified transaction because it was apparent and obvious to everybody that he only did this for the money. He wasn't being really sincere in his transaction from the get-go. And Ben-Tsion adds, from the fact that Tosafot equate this case of the redeeming the firstborn to the real estate case that I just discussed, it's apparent that Rabbi Hanina saw the same thing in that guy, in the father. He didn't intend to give the money to the Kohen with sincerity. It was obvious through his panting and through his anti-behavior. Similar to the case of the real estate case in Masechet Ketubot. Because we're dealing here with a case where it is apparent that this was what it was in his heart to begin with at the time of the transaction. I'll go on one more paragraph and then I'll stop in case there are any immediate pressing questions, so that everything is clear. Tangential questions I'd like to wait to be discussed at the end, but if something is unclear in what I'm reading, I'll take that in one moment. So Ḥakham Ben-Tsion goes on. I'm going to skip 2 paragraphs. From the paragraph of Ulam, Ḥakham Ben-Tsion says, Ulam midivrei HaRambam she'ivanu le'el, based on the passage in Maimonides that we read earlier, it seems that he does not adopt this position of Tosafot. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I missed one point. One point in Tosafot, which was a second point that he raises, is that the pidyon is only negated if Rabbi Hanina were to return the money in reality, if he were to physically act on the urges of the father. But without acting on the urges of the father, then we don't consider the father's intentions alone to mean anything. So now Ḥakham Ben-Tsion has to decide what Harambam's position is in light of these 2 approaches of Tosafot. So he says that Maimonides apparently holds that the pidyon does not take hold for the following reason. For he writes, "V'lo yiten lo hu," the father should not give to the Kohen v'da'ato she'yachzir, with the intent that he's going to give the money back. V'im asak ken v'hachzir lo en beno padui, and if he does so and he returns it to him, his son, this is a repeat of what we said earlier, his son is not redeemed until he agrees to give it to him with a full-fledged heart. This is the point that Ḥakham Ben-Tsion is deriving, the implication that he's deriving from Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, from Harambam's remarks. Umiman shesatam, from the fact that Harambam concludes, v'chatab shelo yiten lo v'da'ato she'yachzir, he should not give to the Kohen with his, meaning the father's intention that the Kohen return it. And he says, Harambam does not specify, he doesn't add the clause that it has to be apparent that this is the case at the time when he was giving it. Mashma she'afil be'ofen she'ein hochacha shekach haya b'libo ve'lo yada shum adam איך היה בדעתו אפילו הכי אין בנו פדוי. He says it's apparent from Harambam's position that even if he was the only one in the world to know his own intentions, that he didn't intend to give this as a full-fledged gift to the Kohen, the pidyon still does not take hold because, well, we're going to see in a second why, but unlike Tosafot that held that it has to be apparent, for Harambam, that is not a requirement. V'im ken kasher. This presents itself as a difficulty. Because at the end of the day, we still hold that matters of the heart are null and void in a court of law. See, Tosafot said one of the exceptions to the rule of matters of the heart are null and void is if I have evidence, if I have proof that there's some ill intent or ulterior motive to the contrary. But for Harambam, based on this reading of Harambam that Ḥakham Ben-Tsion is presenting, I don't even need evidence presenting to the contrary. It's enough that in the depths of his heart, with no evidence to the contrary, that this guy doesn't want to give the gift to the Kohen in a sincere manner. So that leaves us with the original question now. How do I resolve this issue of Devarim Shebalev Enam Devarim? As we're going to see momentarily, this is relevant for our case because at the core of things, that's really what we are concerned for when we're dealing with the convert. When the convert says, yeah, Rabbi, I accept all the mitzvot. Mr. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, do you understand that once you convert, you're going to have to adopt all the laws of Shabbat? It carries a severe prohibition. It's a capital crime if you violate Shabbat knowingly. Do you realize you're going to have to observe very strict laws of Nidah, the laws of Kashrut? They're so intricate. You're going to have your world turned upside down. Yeah, Rabbi, I understand. Everything is, as you say, I accept it. No problem. So, okay, I mean, the Bet Din can accept this testimony and they can go forth with it. But based on where we currently stand, with what Harambam says, such a conversion, if it's just blanket and empty, okay statements, presents itself as a serious problem for the conversion to take hold. Potentially at the cost of nobody even knowing, which is very serious. So, before we move on, any questions about just the basic words that we have read so far? Okay. So Ḥakham Ben-Tsion resolves this issue. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion takes one obscure Gemara and resolves it with another obscure Gemara. You see, this is what I was talking about earlier when I said his method is to stick to the primary sources and to resolve contradictions and dilemmas that are scattered throughout the Talmud through his analysis of the primary sources as opposed to quoting from the buffet of sources that Ḥakham Ovadia would tend to do. So the Gemara Chulin Daf Lamed Tet Amud Aleph presents a machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, rabbi and pupil. What was the debate? The debate was about the status of shechita. I have an animal, guy has an animal, does shechita on the animal, but he intends to slaughter this animal for sacrificial purposes that are not so kosher. He intends to sprinkle the blood for foreign worship and to offer the fat and limbs and what have you for foreign worship. Rabbi Yochanan says, I'm sorry, you cannot partake in this, even if the shechita is 100% good. The Shlakish student held otherwise. He held, no, it's kasher. The root of the debate being what? Basically, the root of the debate pertains to whether or not we derive shechita procedures from the laws of korbanot. Normally, we assume that shechita it's not an avodah. So if it's not a formal worship in the Bet Midrash, it should be excluded from the laws pertaining to sacrificial offering. Rabbi Yochanan, for reasons I won't get into right now, held otherwise, and he held that the meat is not only unfit to be eaten, you also cannot derive benefit from it. You can't sell it, you can't derive any sort of benefit from it. Okay, why is this important? This is important because, as a follow-up to this discussion, the Gemara says there's a beraita, there's a concurrence from an earlier source that supports the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, and the Gemara talks about a case slightly different. It says shachata ve'achakaf chishav aleha. Let's say the guy intended to do shechita. He did the shechita, no ill intent at the time of the slaughtering, but after the slaughtering, he said, you know what? It would be a great idea to offer this beautiful lamb to a Greek god or to some pagan entity. In Caesarea, this Rabbanan de Kisrin. This was the prestigious court that the Talmud Yerushalmi often quotes, the court of Caesarea. And this case was presented before them. Velo amru ba lo isur velo heter. They did not rule one way or the other. The halakha follows Rabbi Yochanan in the first case. The first case pertains to slaughtering with the idolatrous intentions at the time of the slaughtering. This case is a little different. The second case is discussing the ill intentions after the fact. Post facto, I want to give it to a foreign deity. Why did the court not resolve this issue? It's because of a deference that the court gave for the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel in another source. The source is, and this is the part that's relevant for us, Hakotev nechasav la'acherim. Let's say you have a guy who's passing away, and in his will, he's writing off all of his assets to other people, not to his kids. Ve'ayu ba'em aradim. And among his assets, he has some servants. Ve'amar hala ifshi afshe bahem. Regarding these servants, I have no care for them. I don't care for them. I'm not really including them in my in my will. They're meaningless. Now the question is, what do we do with this statement? Everything else is being written off, but these servants are not. If the individuals that are acquiring this package of assets, if among them there is a Kohen and he acquires them, these servants may eat terumah, meaning they're property of the Kohen. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, this is the opinion we want to focus on. Kevan she'amar, since the guy said, Hala i'afshe bahen, I don't care about these servants. Kevar zaku bahen yorshim, the inheritors, the next of kin of this individual, acquire him. Not the people that he wrote to. Not the people to whom the other assets were addressed. Without going into all the details over here, basically, the root of this debate pertains to what? It pertains to who gets first dibs. In such a case, the initial comments of this guy who's either very old or passing away or whatever, and he's writing his will, he presents himself as not caring for his servants. What does that mean? It means he's mafkir the servants. The servants are basically ownerless. So if they're ownerless, and the Gemara goes on to say, we're talking about a case here where the servants were acquired by somebody else on behalf of either the inheritors or the others, whichever comes first. The Gemara says, in such a case, do we assume that the intention of the individual follows his first remarks or his final remarks? See, the Gemara later concludes and says that at the end, he's soveach, he's upset about the incident. He screams about it and says, no, that's not what I intended. I don't want these servants. But when the servants were first acquired, he didn't say anything about it. Right? So which side of this guy's testimony do we accept? Do we accept the side that had his company men or his kids or whoever acquired the servants on his behalf? Do we accept the side that accepted the servants through a third party where he didn't say anything, he just accepted it, or do we accept the side where he made a big deal about it at the end? The halacha in that case, and also in a similar case that Harambam talks about regarding a matana, this would apply to any generic gift, is safek. To safek. This is also the same case is brought down in the Maramba Batrada Koflam et Zayin and Bet, and Harambam presents this as follows. He says if a person acquires a gift and the gift is accepted by the third party, let's assume it's a Rolex for argument's sake, and later on the new owner of the Rolex says, you know, I really don't want this. Why did you accept this on my behalf? This is not for me. Rambam says the ownership of this item is in the status of safek. We don't know if we're going to follow his silence. It's a good question, by the way, because usually we say shetika la hoda'a. A person's silence is not akin to him agreeing to something. So that's perhaps a discussion, question worth looking into. But for the Talmud, for Harambam, it's uncertain if we follow the silence of the individual as acceptance, or if we follow the remarks he makes at the end protesting to acquiring the servants or the item or the Rolex or whatever it is. Obviously, just as a parenthesis, I'm not, God forbid, equating human beings to Rolexes. This is purely an example that the Gemara gives for legal purposes and for legal discussion, just to get the principle across. Having said that, Ḥakham Ben-Tsion brings us back to our case. Based on this analysis, the topic that we mentioned regarding the Kohen and the redeeming of the firstborn that we mentioned earlier, says it makes perfect sense now. Kemin Homer, it's a strict position that's adopted. The Kevan de Naktina Nakumra Misfeka Bedin Ochiach Sofot Chilato, Mimela Hacha, Bedin Pidyon Haben, Kevan de Chazia Sherose Ha'ab Kesef HaPidyon, Chazara, Ochiach Sofot Chilato. He says, we can take the same resolution that we adopted regarding these two previous cases and plug it into the case of the father and the Kohen. Since it's unclear if the father intended to present himself as he originally did, which seemed genuine, right? It's doubtful if we follow that, or if we follow his later intentions where he's presenting himself as wanting the money back. We don't know which of these two emotional states is his true intention. Even if you want to adopt the position that matters of the heart are null and void, he says, that's irrelevant. I don't even need for you to bring the canon of matters of the heart are null and void, because I have another canon. And that is the canon of the doubt of, or actually the consideration of one's final actions proving one's initial intent. And due to a matter of doubt, he says that's why Harambam says that the Pidyon Haben does not take effect in such a case, because the Pidyon has to be done in an undoubtful state. We have a rule in Halakha, somebody who wants to withdraw or extract money from another Jew has the burden of proof to present that he's owed that debt. If the case is doubtful, then I don't have proof to present that the debt was paid. Right? If I'm a father, I'm redeeming my firstborn, and I can't definitively prove that I paid for my firstborn son to be redeemed, then the pidyon is not good. Amor me'ata, we can now conclude שגם במקום שדברים שבלב אינם דברים, אם בסופו של דבר עשה מעשה שהוכיח סופו תפילתו, הווה ספקה, ונתין בזה לחומרה לשני צדדים. He says, similarly in all instances where we can present the canon of הוכיח סופו על תפילתו, where the end actions of an individual reflect on the initial intentions, we have to be strict. Ben lekula, ben lekumra. We have to be strict for applying the status of doubt in both cases. And he says, therefore, with regard to these converts who are not so observant, even if we don't include their personal unspoken intentions, if the convert does something that he does something that indicates that he did not truly intend to convert sincerely, whereby he is not he presents himself as not accepting the yoke of the misvot to observe them, he has the status of a safek ger. I'm going to end off here for the reading of Ḥakham Ben-Tsion's words inside, but the basis for raising this question in the first place actually goes back to Harambam himself. Harambam in chapter 14 of Isurei Biyah, which you see over here in front of you, talks about the procedural standards of a Bet Din, and you'll notice over here in Halacha Yod Dalet, in most editions, in other editions, Halacha Yod Zayin, the Harambam presents a case where a Bet Din converted an individual without thorough investigation, or whereby they didn't go through the procedure that the Gemara outlines. They didn't inform him of the misvot and the reward and punishment for them. But verbal procedure aside, they did a valid milah, they did tevilah for him. Rambam says this person is still a convert. Even where it's apparent that the guy is or the girl is converting for ulterior motives. Let's say it's for marriage or whatever the case is. Since the guy did milah, did tevilah, he's no longer a Gentile. Key term here. But we are concerned for his status until his righteousness is made clear. This line right here is the subject of great debate among the poskim. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion takes this at face value. He takes this at face value in the sense that we really don't know their status. And where do we say that this clause applies? It applies where A, the convert has no idea what he's doing, or he's violating the Torah from the get-go because, well, he had other motives in mind. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion goes on to point out that this whole discussion does not apply where it's obvious and clear that the convert did accept the mitzvot and he was righteous for a period of time. What that period of time is, Ḥakham Ben-Tsion does not specify. But where it is clear that he adopted the mitzvot sincerely, but down the road he forgoes observant life, then we don't say this. Then even according to Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, certainly according to other poskim, but according to Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, there's no doubt that this guy is Jew. What's doubtful is the status of a convert who from the get-go, right after he comes out of the mikveh, right after she comes out of the mikveh, is driving a car on Shabbat. That's where Ḥakham Ben-Tsion is talking about doubtful status. Okay. I can go on a little further unless there are questions. I'm happy to save the rest of the time for questions.
I have a question.
Please.
The words of the Rambam are a little troubling in that I believe you said before that it's noda. If it's known, so it sounds to me like he's saying that the Bet Din could possibly know in advance that the person's gior was not sincere, but yet they go through with it and convert him anyway.
Yes.
So that's very, very interesting because it sounds to me as though the Bet Din is being negligent in that regard, which is part of the problem.
So it's very, very good that you bring that point up. Let me pull up something for you that Rambam alludes to earlier. In Halacha Yod Bet, he says because of the ulterior motives that were common in the days of David HaMelech, lo kiblu bet din gerim kol yemei David u'Shlomo. Throughout the entire reign of David and Shlomo, the Sanhedrin did not, and the various district courts under the Sanhedrin did not accept converts. Maybe they're doing so out of fear. And to the contrary, in the days of Shlomo, could be maybe because they were doing so well, everybody wants to be a Jew. That's fashionable. But he says, Rambam says, even after the moratorium placed on conversion, you had many who converted bifnei hedyotot. Bifnei hedyotot, kesef mishneh, Rabbi Yosef points out over here, are courts that were unsanctioned by the Sanhedrin, but nevertheless, from the point of view of law, had the ability to function as courts for the purposes of admitting Jews into the Jewish people. There's no halacha that says these hedyotot couldn't operate, but it was against the procedures that the Sanhedrin had in effect during that period of time. And the same word is used by Rambam. Same thing as we said before regarding the status of the converts who are not observant from the get-go. Also over here, they were doubtful. Lo dochinotan, you can't turn them away because they still did milan tevilah. They also were not mekaravinotan ad shetira'eh acharitam. They did not fully incorporate them into the Jewish people until they saw the end result of these people. There's more I could say about this, but your point about Noda is already addressed by Ḥakham. Good point. Good question. Any other questions?
Is there any safek, and right now they're in a safek, let's say, according to Rambam, do we treat them any differently? Is there any nafkamina that we would treat them any differently?
Yes. Nafkamina is as follows. Lechatchila, you're not going to marry them off to a Jew. Right? Just like you have by a shituki or an asufi. Let's say you find a kid in the street, no idea where he came from. He has a status of safek too. You don't marry such a person to a Jew. By the same token, let's say the couple's married, right? So it's a good question. Do we say do we say that we're kofim otam? We force the couple to get divorced? I don't know. It's a good question. Do they observe nidah if they're going to remain together? Yes, misafek they do. Does the ger have to still observe Shabbat? Yes, he still has to observe Shabbat. Again, lechumrah. It goes lechumrah both ways. What's interesting though is that based on what Rambam says, both in Halacha Yod Bet and Yod Dalet, a second conversion would not need to be done. If the convert makes apparent their intentions at the end, then great. But what's apparent is final. So in other words, if it's apparent to a Bedin that the conversion never took hold to begin with, the whole thing was absolute sheker v'chazav, we have texts proving it, nothing was intended, then nothing happened over here. If there's a safek regarding the guy's intentions, and later it's actually apparent that he chose to adopt the position of being observant and grew in his observance, we'll say. Then the end does resolve the initial status of the person once it's clear. Okay. I hope that addresses that question.
Could these Batei Din be the hediotot consist of Gerim themselves?
Rambam doesn't address that directly. It's a big debate among the Acharonim. From Rambam, from the Shulchan Aruch, there's no explicit source that restricts Gerim from serving on Batei Din for conversion, although those of us in the know do know that that's not the norm, because we try to avoid all doubt regarding conversion. There's even a single opinion that's against something. We try to avoid it so that people don't poke holes. I'll point out one final thing in the Teshuvah, which is that of Berit Milah. It's another nafkamina. Let's say you have a child from this convert. Ben-Tsion says, Milah on Shabbat, let's say the child's Berit Milah falls out on Shabbat. Milah on Shabbat only applies to full-fledged Jews. If a person is not a Jew, or if the Milah is for conversion, let's say, okay, then the conversion can wait till tomorrow. I don't need to violate Shabbat with Berit Milah. Says Ben-Tsion, even he says, it's kind of worth seeing inside. He says, Mo'alim have to be very careful. Because Shulchan Aruch says that you cannot do Milah Shabbat for a non-Jewish child. Okay. He goes on to talk about Pidyon Ben and what's the status of he ends up concluding in this Teshuvah that the child born to a woman who is pregnant at the time of conversion, who wishes to do a Pidyon Ben or a Milah, has the child not only obligated in Milah, not only is the child obligated in Milah and Pidyon Ben, the child is obligated from the point of view of being a Jew and not a Ger. That's very, very important, because if the child is a Ger, there's no Pidyon Ben that's required. And if the child is a Ger, then you can't do the Milah on Shabbat. Alternatively, if the child is a girl, if we're dealing with a female, then she cannot marry a Kohen. Whereas for Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, this is, and he goes on throughout the rest of the Teshuvah to prove this through careful analysis. He says even for Ashkenazim, the child has a full-fledged status of being a Jew. She can marry a Kohen, and he must be circumcised on Shabbat with Pidyon Ben. For those who know, Alav Shalom, Rabbi David Lurfield of Miami, I once asked him this very question. I was dealing with a case of a ger that was consulting me for some advice, and his wife, it's a long story, but basically the wife in question was pregnant, and she had not yet converted. And he says, I'm happy to take care of the conversion, the giur, but is she pregnant? Pause. On second thought, Yosef, don't tell me, I don't need to know. It's irrelevant for this purpose. The child's going to be a Jew anyway. So it's a very, very important lesson for people in the process of giur. I wish more Batei Din were aware of this, because unfortunately it's a very contentious point where many Batei Din nowadays will harass converts in the process for a variety of reasons. One of which is this: you're dealing with the case of a child who is a woman who is pregnant, and they erroneously, according to Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, adopt the position that the child is not Jewish. All right.
Super fascinating. If anyone has any questions, comments, you can raise your hand or unmute, write in the chat box. I'll start off by asking, why can't we say that when they're mitgayer and then we see them directly violate the Torah, they drive afterwards? Why can't we say that only reveals, meaning it doesn't reveal that they didn't accept all Torah mitzvot, they accepted all Torah mitzvot, they just feel they can't do it yet, meaning they believe that, and they'll be punished, they believe that this is something they need to do. It's not that I converted without accepting it. I accepted it. I'm just weak, I can't do it.
That's a very good question, and that position is actually what the Achiezer and what many Achronim adopt. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion famously adopted this view. Rabbi Moshe Dinam also of Jerba famously adopted this view. He was regarding somewhat of a famous case of an Israeli basketball player in the 70s who was going to convert, but he said, Rabbi, I'm playing basketball on Shabbat. It's going to involve me being in a bus. It's going to involve me doing minor Isurei Derabanan on Shabbat. He converted. Well, excuse me. He approved of the conversion. I don't believe he converted him, but he approved of the conversion for this reason. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, we didn't read this inside. He believes the conversion does not take hold in such a case because he views the conversion as a transaction. Legally, there's a matana being given, so to speak, to him, which is the conversion. That minor point over there is what leads Ḥakham Ben-Tsion to relate this to the other cases of monetary transaction, where the person's intentions, seemingly rejecting the gift, put the status of the gift in jeopardy. But B, he also doesn't prove that point. It's interesting. He doesn't prove that conversion is a matana. It's kind of he leaves it open-ended, which is interesting. I don't know why he does that. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein alav shalom does the same thing, by the way. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein talks about ger katan, regarding a child who is being brought up in a non-observant home. Famous question, famous dilemma that always comes up in cases like this in America in particular. Do we convert? Does the Bet-Din convert the child if the household that he's being brought up in is not observant? From a simple understanding, the Gemara, they're particularly Sephardi Achronim adopt this position. The Gemara says that the Bet-Din acts on behalf of the child because it's a zechut. It's a merit for the child to be a Jew. And we say Zochin Adam Shelo Befanav. The Bet-Din can merit and acquire the status of the child without his ability to consent. If he openly rejects the conversion upon Bar Mitzvah, that's a separate story. But Rav Moshe Feinstein says, what good is it if he's growing up in a non-observant home? It does nobody any good, and this cannot be done because the transaction, again, Rav Moshe Feinstein goes back to the idea of this being a transaction, never takes hold in the first place. It's a view adopted by some, not by all.
And is there a remedy to the situation once now there's safek? Can they remedy that by proving that, going back on the intention?
So I addressed that earlier. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion doesn't say so explicitly, but I think it's clear from Harambam that according to this approach, if they present themselves as fully observant and they're very clearly Baalei Teshuvah, then their status is no longer doubtful. If they act in accordance with all other observant Jews, Harambam gives examples. They're mafrish terumot u'maserot. They observe Shabbat. They're noheg keminhag Israel. Then then this poses no problem. But if it is obvious, apparent that from the get-go there was no kabbalat hamitzvot, then it's not so clear. It's not so clear. Of course, seemingly Ḥakham Ben-Tsion would say that no conversion ever took place. That's a view that's adopted by many. But not everybody accepts that. This is my personal view. With all due respect, I don't even come to the toenails of Ḥakham Ben-Tsion, but the Mooncatcher Rebbe Alav Shalom, Rabbi Yaakov Shpira of Moonkatch was famous for his view of Choshishim Lo, that statement of Harambam, Choshishim Lo Ashet Ba'ersi Kuto, applies with regard to the convert's ne'emanut, not to his status, but to his ne'emanut. In other words, he has the status of a full-fledged Jew. That's why Harambam says his kiddushin is still a kiddushin. Ḥakham Ben-Tsion says no. Harambam's talking about a case where he later was not observant. That's where Harambam says his kiddushin is kiddushin. The Minchad Elazar says no. Even if the guy was not observant from the get-go, he's still a Jew. But I'm not going to trust him to be an ed. I'm not going to trust him to sit on a bet din. I'm not going to eat in this guy's home. He's not going to be the mashgiach in the restaurant, etc., etc. That's so. It's a position that is accepted by many batei din, and I think it's one that's also worth being aware of.
On some level, you can kind of see the advantage of having, on the one hand, a standardized de'ah for conversion as opposed to every individual bet din having their own standards. You can kind of see that as an advantage on the one hand. But we know that on the other hand, every independent bet din has the ability to have their own standards, particularly for conversion. But in this, it kind of makes sense to have one way of thinking. Either we're going to hold like the Mooncatcher Rebbe does, or we're going to hold by Rabbi Ben-Tsion Abba Shaul.
The problem, there's an advantage to it. Certainly, there's an advantage to having a unified standard of conversion procedure when it comes to removing all these cases of doubt. The problem with that is that that's just not what the law what the law sets forth. Even in the days of Shlomo and David, we saw that the great Sanhedrin can have a certain procedure intact, and you can have these hedyotot come along and legally perform conversions that are unsanctioned by the big boss. The reason for that, Maran writes in the Bet Yosef, I believe in this siman, Resh Samechet, the siman that we quoted. It goes back to the rule of Hakol lefi re'ot enei abetim. When it comes to matters of conversion, we always, assuming minimal standards are met, everything follows the, how do I phrase this? Not the conjecture, but the subjectivity of the case presented before the bet din. That's why the Gemara on Shabbat, I believe that Lamed Dalet, it's a famous case where Hillel converted a guy who famously said, I want to be a Kohen Gadol. Right? Another case where he said, I accept the Torah Shebiktav and not the Torah Shebe'al Peh. Oh, Hillel converted Karaites? No. Hillel saw, for whatever reason, that there's hope that this guy is going to be a great tzaddik. That was enough. That was enough for Hillel to convert the individual. So, again, I think Rabbi Chaim Elazar Shapira's famous, Minchad Elazar's famous stance of not holding that convert in a status of position of ne'emanut, my humble opinion, it's more sensible. I'm not here to discuss that every day. I just, right, that requires a separate shiur. This is Ḥakham Ben-Tsion's position, nevertheless, it's one that's worth being aware of. Next time, God willing, we're going to discuss, I hope, the status of born Jews who are mechalelei Shabbat, who violate Shabbat in open. Also, very common case that as rabbis and as lay people, we all have to deal with, particularly, actually, no, it's, I think, equally an issue in Israel and abroad alike. So, not going to be discussed next time.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Very looking forward for your future classes. B'ezrat Hashem, we can continue learning and hopefully in times of peace as well. Laila tov, everyone.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.